The reason I wanted to put this map on the front is because if you'll look at on the bottom center, you see the Dead Sea, and then if you go to the left and then up just a little bit, you'll see Joppa, and then if you go up from there, you'll see Caesarea. I just wanted to show you that because that's where Acts 10 is taking place. Whenever Peter left Joppa and he went up to Caesarea. So they're between really Judea and Galilee, but they're on the coast. So when you see up at Galilee, that's where Nazareth is at. Then down at Judea is where Jerusalem, Bethlehem's at. So Capernaum is up by the Sea of Galilee. So you have the Sea of Galilee, then you have the Jordan River that goes down to the Dead Sea. And it flows into the Dead Sea. The Jordan River is long, very, very long. So I just wanted to give you a picture of it so you can see where this is taking place. It's close to Samaria. And I thought I would do something. I'll try to do something if I can do it kind of quickly. I was kind of hoping Miss Leslie would be here. I was doing this for her. But we'll do it for you. Let's just see if we can do it and get to our notes tonight. I think it'll really be of a help to us. So let's just start at the beginning when you have Adam and Eve and they're in this garden. You have Adam and Eve. And then they sin. God kicks them out of the garden. And now they're just in the land. When they get into the land, there is sin everywhere. You know, first of all, after they've sinned, and then you have Cain and Abel, and they sin. Then when you get to chapter 6, you have the flood with Noah and the flood. So then that's chapter 6 of Genesis. And then when you get to after the flood, and they get off the flood, out of the boat after the flood, and then you have the Tower of Babel over here in chapter 11. It's a ziggurat, I guess, but it's a Tower of Babel. They're trying to make it to the heavens, and I think they're worshiping the stars. God told them to scatter and just to go out into the earth and to the rest of the world, and they disobey God. Everybody is Gentiles. That's chapter 11 of Genesis. Then you get to chapter 12 of Genesis. God calls a man named Abram. Got an R in there. Abram. God calls Abram. Chapter 12, get you up out of the country, go to a land that I will show you. I will bless them that bless you, curse them that curse you, and your seed shall be as the heavens, And of course, he doesn't have any children. But anyway, it's Abraham. So far, everybody, Gentiles. There are no Jews. They're Gentiles. And everybody, except for a line, but everybody, which Abraham comes from that line, and even Abraham and his family are worshiping idolatry. There's nobody going after God. All right, somebody read this out loud so the camera can pick you up. Deuteronomy chapter number 7. Well, hold on, we're getting too far ahead. Let's go back to here. Look up Deuteronomy 7, but I need to get us there first. So then God calls out Abraham. Abraham has, Isaac. And then Isaac has Jacob. Jacob has the 12 sons, which are the 12 tribes of Israel. So you have the 12 tribes. But there's still no Jews. Out of Jacob comes Joseph. And Joseph is sold into slavery. You know all this. He's sold into slavery. They take him Potiphar's house. They take him to Egypt, and he's in Egypt. They're there for just over 400 years. And while they're there, God sends a deliverer, Moses. He is a deliverer, a type of Christ. He's going to deliver the people. When Joseph goes there, he goes in with 8 people. He comes out with probably a couple million. And they are the Hebrew people. They are the Israelites, the Jews. Because Moses was even a Hebrew and Joseph's a Hebrew. But when they come out as Jews. One people group. They go into the wilderness and they spend 40 years in the wilderness. And then they come out of the wilderness. But so far, there's nobody that's really worshiping God. So what does God do? He calls these people to himself. All right, now, somebody read Deuteronomy chapter 7, starting in verse 6, 7, and 8. So he's called them out, and he's chosen. That's the only group that God has ever chosen to be a special people. Matter of fact, if we're not going to go back there, to read Exodus 19. Exodus 19 tells the entire Jewish nation, the Israelites, they are a kingdom of priests. They are to be a priest to all the Gentiles, the whole world. And that's what the whole kingdom was set up to be. But even in the Jewish nation, when he set them apart, they're still not worshiping God. They're going after idols. And even so, he goes down to the line of Aaron, and this the Levite line, but it starts with Aaron. And so now the Levites are going to be the priestly line that everybody comes from. But they're still not worshiping God the way that they're supposed to. And this is the way it should have been. The rest of the world should look at the Jews and say, your God supplies all of your food. He does all of your fighting for you. When you go into battle and your shoes never wore out in the wilderness, they should have said, we want your God. And that's how the Gentiles could have gotten saved, because they wanted the Jews' God, and they should have been a kingdom of priests. But instead, since the priests were corrupt, they said, we want a God like your God. We want a king like the world has, instead of a king that we're serving, because God is the king. Remember what God told Samuel, they haven't rejected you, they've rejected me. So give them a king. They want a king, give them one too. Now you have kings. And you go through the judges and you go through the king stage. But anyway, all through the Old Testament, God has promised them, of course, a land promise. He's promised them a seed promise. That's the seed promise, and Jesus is the seed. Remember Galatians 3:16, that Abraham was promised a seed, and he's talking about singular, not plural. He's talking about Jesus. That's Galatians 3:16. He's given them a land promise, a seed promise. He's given them a kingdom promise. What does he say all through? Remember, I gave you a sheet. It was about 5 or 6 pages, I think, of promises in the Bible that God was going to set up a king to sit on David's throne that would rule forever. Well, that hasn't happened yet. But all the Old Testament promised of a kingdom and a seed, which is the Messiah. They knew the Messiah was coming. They knew that Christ was coming. Christ is Messiah. They just didn't know who it was going to be. In the New Testament, well, let's start here. This might open up the Bible to you if you read it through. Like every year I read it through at least once, but it makes sense to me because if you put it in order, all of the Old Testament promises of a Messiah, the Christ. And he's going to, all the Old Testament says, in the Old Testament, not all of it, but in the Old Testament it says he's going to, the Messiah is coming, he's going to die, be buried, but he's going to rise again. The Old Testament prophesied. So when you get to the New Testament, and Jesus is telling them before his death, I'm going to be given to the Gentiles. I'm going to Jerusalem. I'm going to be handed to the Gentiles. I'm going to die, but I'm going to rise again the third day. Remember, he told his disciples that over and over, and they still didn't get it. What did Peter say? May it never be. But he told them over and over, I'm going to die, but I'm going to rise again. Matter of fact, the Pharisees, give us a sign. Okay, I'll give you a sign. Here's the sign. Just as Jonah was in the belly of the whale for 3 days, so shall the Son of Man be in the earth. That's going to be your sign. So when I rise again, that's your sign. Believe on me. So they promised a land promise, a seed promise, and a kingdom promise, but he also said that he was going to die and rise again. And here's something that I wanted to get to. All through the Old Testament, it talks about the day of the Lord, his wrath. This is what the Bible talks about all through the Old Testament. Now, every time I read the Old Testament, I see this. This is what's going to happen. Jesus is going to come, he's going to die, he's going to be buried, he's going to rise again the third day. But they didn't put all that together. Let me tell you what they put together. The Messiah is going to come, he's going to die, he's going to rise again. He's going to rise again. He's going to heaven. And then, wrath is coming. And then, the second coming of Jesus. He's coming back. He's going to set up his kingdom. After the wrath, he's going to set up his kingdom. It's going to be perfect peace. You're going to see that all through the Old Testament now when you read it. You start reading it. When Peter's preaching, remember he started in Acts 2, Acts 1, but he started preaching in Acts 2. He is always preaching the gospel of the kingdom. He knows nothing about what happened. This is what happened. After the Old Testament, Jesus died, he rose again. What should have happened according to all prophecy? Wrath. And then Jesus coming back and setting up his kingdom. That's what should have happened according to prophecy. What did happen? He didn't come back yet.
That's why they kept saying, it's at hand. Like as soon as he rose again, they started saying, hey, it's upon us.
That's right. The first thing, Acts 1:6, what they asked Jesus, have you at this time come back to restore Israel? And the kingdom of heaven, repent, for the kingdom of heaven is at hand. That's before he died. The kingdom of heaven's at hand. Why is the kingdom of heaven at hand? Because the king's here. They knew the king was coming. They just didn't know his name. You get to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. The Messiah is here. The Christ is here. When you see Jesus Christ, you're going to see it tonight. When you see Jesus Christ, Christ is not his last name. He is the anointed one, the Messiah, the prophesied one. So he's saying Jesus is the Christ. He's the one that's been prophesied about. He's the one that all the Old Testament points to. And here he is. All of the miracles that he has done, everything points to Jesus because everything was prophesied that he did. He did not do one thing that was not prophesied about. And that's because when he got here, he could do what the Bible said the Messiah would do. He did it to prove that he is who the Old Testament says he is. He's the Messiah, and you need to believe on him. The problem is, remember John 1:11, he came into his own received him not. So when Jesus came, who did he come for? The Jews. He didn't come for us. He came for the Jews. Somebody read Matthew 15, verse 24. Matthew 15, 24.
But he answered and said, I am not sent but unto the lost sheep of the house of Israel.
That's the only ones that he came for was Israel. Why is that? Jerusalem is where the kingdom has to be set up. And it has to go through the Jews. And the Jews, remember the Great Commission, go make disciples of all nations starting in Jerusalem, and then the gospel should have spread. You go from Jerusalem to Judea, Samaria, and then to the othermost parts of the world. But when they go to Jerusalem, what happens? They get rejected. Salvation can't go to the rest of the world but through the Jews, because the Jews have rejected him. So what did God do? The book of Acts, the entire book of Acts is a transitional book, but what's the book of Acts about? The fall of the Jews. That's what the entire book's about. So the Jews fell spiritually. And God now is saving people without the Jews, without the covenant, and without the law. Why do you say all this, Scott? Because tonight, when you see, you're not going to see something that's been hidden since the foundation of the world. You're going to see something that's been preached since the foundation of the world. This doesn't happen until Paul, because he gives him something that's been hid in God since the foundation of the world. That's why. So I hope it makes sense as we go through all of this. All right, Acts chapter 10. And we stopped last week in 33, so we'll start today in 34 of Acts chapter 10. Let me just give us a little background, a little summary of what's happened. God, there was a man that's been very devout, and not only has he been, this is talking about Cornelius, not only is he a devout man, he feared God, he gave much alms to the people, and he prayed to God always. That's chapter 10, verse 2. His name is Cornelius. So he was a devout man, he feared God, he gave his money, and he prayed to God. He was praying in the 9th hour, and he got a vision, and the vision was telling him, you need to call for Simon Peter, and Peter's going to be in Simon the tanner's house. He's in Joppa. Send for him. So God tells him, Cornelius, this before Peter's dream. And then Peter fell into a vision. It was noontime. He's hungry. He goes on top of the roof, and he goes into a trance. He sees this sheet coming down, and on the sheet are all of the unclean animals. And the Lord tells him, Peter, eat. Not so, Lord. I've never eaten anything that's common or unclean. And God says, anything that I call clean, don't call it common. So Cornelius sends 3 men to Joppa, and when they get there, I think this is kind of funny, because it says earlier that to Cornelius, go get Peter, he's going to tell you what you need to do. They go get Peter, he comes back to the house. Why am I here? You're supposed to tell me. No, why am I here? So anyway, that's where we are. In verse 33, Cornelius told him, man, you've done well that you've come here. So verse 34. Then Peter opened his mouth and said, of a truth, I perceive that God is no respecter of persons. And I put on your outline this. Peter's the one learning. He's the one getting the lesson, not Cornelius. Peter's the one that needs to learn from God that God is no respecter of persons. He should have known this already because the Old Testament says it several times. I've listed 3 on your outline, plus it's in the New Testament lots of times. Yes.
The vision Peter had of the food, he said, kill and eat. He's not talking about food. He's talking about people, ain't he?
Right. But the way that it's like an illustration. He's given him this illustration, this picture of food. I don't eat anything unclean, to show him a picture because he thinks the Gentile is unclean. To him, they are not worthy. So now he's learning, hey, God's not a respecter of persons. I thought it was the Jews that were special, that he liked us. He didn't like y'all. You mean God likes you? Can you imagine? Jesus, somebody turn to Matthew 5, verse 10 and read that. Matthew 5, verse 10. I want to show you what Jesus told Peter, so you might can get an understanding of what's going on in Peter's mind. Matthew 5:10. No, I'm sorry. Matthew 10:5. I get my numbers backwards in my head. Matthew 10:5, I think it is. What does that say, Mr. Ori?
These 12 men sent forth and commanded them, saying, go not into the way of the Gentile, and unto any city of the Samaritan enter ye not.
Yep. So he's telling them, the Jews, his apostles, he's just called 12 apostles from the disciples. He says, do not go in the way of the Gentiles. And don't even go to the Samaritans. You know, they hated the Samaritans too. And they're partly Jew. But the Gentile, don't go over there. Jesus knows the kingdom has to start in Jerusalem. And they have to get saved and get on board. Then it can go to the rest of the world. So he's telling them, don't go to the Gentiles. I'm sure Peter's still thinking about this.